Hello and welcome to History at Night. The story of Roman dominance does not echo with the roaring crowds of the Colosseum or marching of iron legions. Instead, its true survival rested entirely on the quiet power of a single woman sitting alone in the suffocating dark. Tonight we will step inside a forbidden silence to witness the burden of the eternal flame and discover how one sleepless night held the fragile fate of an entire superpower. Step into the circular heart of the Roman Forum, where the thick marble walls of the Temple of Vesta rise against the freezing night. There are no expansive windows here, no balconies overlooking the bustling city streets, only a secluded and suffocatingly silent architectural marvel designed for one singular purpose. This circular sanctuary feels remarkably like the ultimate corner office of the ancient world, in a place of supreme authority wrapped in absolute isolation. The air inside this heavy stone vault is a complex mixture of freezing winter drafts and the faint, ever-present scent of burning oak and fragrant incense. You can feel the biting chill of the marble floor seeping through the thin leather of your sandals, a constant reminder of the harsh reality hidden behind the glamorous facade of imperial power. The dancing shadows cast by the central fire flicker across the smooth stone surfaces, creating a mesmerizing but deeply solitary atmosphere. Standing perfectly still amidst this dancing interplay of light and profound darkness is Aquilia, a woman, who commands an empire without ever lifting a sword. At exactly 35 years of age, she has already spent 25 grueling years within these unforgiving walls, rising through the ranks with an unmatched level of professional dedication. She is the Virgo Maxima, the undisputed chief executive officer of Rome's most vital spiritual enterprise, projecting a sharply intelligent and flawlessly calm demeanour. Her pure white woolen robes are not merely religious garments, but the ultimate corporate uniform, signifying a heavy burden of leadership that very few men in the Senate could ever hope to carry. The flickering firelight reveals a face sculpted by years of immense pressure, characterised by piercing eyes that have seen generations of politicians rise and fall from grace. She orchestrates this massive, invisible machinery of state security with a terrifying level of precision, demanding absolute perfection from herself and her subordinates. Her position grants her an extraordinary level of influence that mirrors the modern visionary leader sitting alone at the absolute peak of their industry. When Aquilia steps outside these massive doors, the chaotic streets of Rome fall into a reverent silence, and even the most arrogant senators step aside to let her pass. She controls immense wealth, holds the power to pardon condemned prisoners with a single touch, and manages a portfolio of sacred duties that keep the empire breathing. But here is where it gets interesting. Once the heavy bronze doors swing shut and the adoring public is left behind, the crushing weight of ultimate responsibility descends upon her shoulders like a physical force. There is no board of directors to consult, no trusted advisors to share the unbearable stress of knowing that a single mistake could trigger a catastrophic collapse. She is entirely self-reliant, trapped in a beautiful cage of her own making, navigating the terrifying isolation that always accompanies absolute and unquestioned authority. This profound loneliness becomes undeniably palpable during the dead of night, when the rest of the vibrant city is blissfully surrendered to deep sleep. As she paces the curved perimeter of the sacred hearth, the only sound echoing through the cavernous space is the soft, rhythmic sweeping of her heavy woolen garments. The stark contrast between the warm, glowing heart of the fire and the freezing, unforgiving shadows at the edges of the room perfectly mirrors her internal reality. She is the solitary guardian of the light, completely cut off from the simple, everyday warmth of normal human connections, romantic relationships, and ordinary family life. Every single hour of her existence is strictly regimented and meticulously planned, leaving absolutely no room for spontaneous joy or the careless freedom of an ordinary citizen. The immense stone columns surrounding her stand like silent witnesses to her quiet sacrifices, offering no comfort as she battles the overwhelming exhaustion of her solitary watch. Yet, despite the crushing isolation and the relentless physical demands of this eternal graveyard shift, Aquilia does not harbour a single ounce of self-pity or regret. She processes her reality with the cold, calculating efficiency of a seasoned executive who fully understands that true greatness requires an astronomical personal cost. Her mind is a highly organised vault of sacred protocols, historical precedents, and crisis management strategies, all functioning flawlessly beneath a mask of absolute serenity. She deliberately chose this path of immense sacrifice, trading the predictable comforts of a mundane domestic life for the intoxicating gravity of shaping history from the shadows. As the bitter wind howls helplessly against the impenetrable walls of the sanctuary, she simply adjusts her posture, radiating an aura of untouchable, quiet power. She is the ultimate architect of Rome's survival, an unsung titan operating in complete solitude, silently keeping the gears of civilization turning while the entire world sleeps. To understand the true weight resting upon her shoulders, you must look beyond the prestigious white robes and examine the brutal nature of her lifelong contract. At an age when most modern children are just beginning to discover their own identities, a 10-year-old girl is abruptly stripped of her family name and her fundamental right to self-determination. She is drafted into a 30-year term of absolute servitude, completely surrendering her individual freedom to serve the collective security of the expanding empire. This is not a career choice you can simply walk away from when the pressure becomes too intense or when the desire for a normal life takes root. Aquilia has already endured 25 exhausting years of this grueling spiritual marathon, suppressing every natural human urge for independence or personal fulfillment. She is tantalizingly close to the finish line, with only 5 agonizingly slow years remaining before she is finally permitted to retire, marry, and reclaim her autonomy. The psychological toll of maintaining this flawless public facade day after day creates a profound level of chronic burnout that few outside these walls could possibly comprehend. You might imagine that sitting in a quiet temple watching a fire is a peaceful meditation, but the reality is a relentless, nerve-wracking exercise in continuous crisis prevention. That sacred flame crackling in the centre of the room is not just a symbolic gesture. It is universally believed to be the literal beating heart of Rome itself. If that fire were to falter and die under her watch, the Romans believed their military legions would be slaughtered, their harvests would fail, and their great republic would crumble. She carries the existential dread of millions of citizens within her own mind, knowing that even a momentary lapse in concentration could unravel centuries of imperial progress. Imagine carrying the weight of a superpower's survival on your shoulders every single night, without a single day of rest or mental reprieve. But here is where it gets interesting, because the Roman state did not merely rely on religious devotion to ensure these women stayed awake during their agonizingly long shifts. They engineered a system of terror and supreme motivation by designing a punishment so unfathomably cruel that it kept the Vestals perpetually alert. If a priestess allowed the sacred fire to extinguish, she was not simply fired from her esteemed position or sent away in quiet disgrace. She would be violently stripped of her sacred ribbons, beaten by the highest religious official, and then subjected to the ultimate penalty for failing her country. Because it was strictly forbidden to spill the blood of a Vestal, a loophole was created where she would be bound, placed on a covered litter, and paraded through silent crowds like a living corpse. She would be forced to descend a ladder into a tiny underground crypt at the Campus Celeratus, left with nothing but a single loaf of bread and a small lamp. Once she reached the bottom of that suffocating dirt chamber, the ladder was pulled up, the entrance was sealed with heavy earth, and she was left to wait for the oxygen to slowly run out. This terrifying prospect of being buried alive in complete darkness serves as the ultimate performance review, hanging over her head during every freezing winter night she spends tending the coals. It is a brilliant, if utterly barbaric, mechanism of state control that completely weaponizes a human being's most primal fear of being buried beneath the ground. Aquilia knows exactly what lies beneath the surface of the city, and that chilling knowledge sharpens her senses far better than any cup of modern coffee ever could. She stares into the glowing embers, acutely aware that the very flames keeping her warm are also the only things keeping her out of a cold, unmarked grave. Every piece of wood she carefully places on the hearth is another calculated step toward that distant day when she can finally walk away as a free woman. You might assume that living every single day under the agonizing threat of a slow, suffocating execution would turn a person into a trembling wreck. It is incredibly easy to picture a fragile woman huddled anxiously by the glowing coals, paralyzed by the sheer terror of making one fatal mistake. But the real secret is something completely different, a profound psychological twist that entirely changes how you must understand this ancient dynamic of authority. Aquilia does not sit in the freezing shadows consumed by a creeping paranoia, because she has mastered a level of profound self-reliance that few will ever achieve. Instead of fearing the immense machinery of the Roman state, she actually looks up at the towering hills of the city and feels a deep sense of pity. She knows that the men who claim to rule the world are actually entirely enslaved by their own desperate ambitions and their crippling fear of losing everything. Just a few hundred yards away from her quiet sanctuary, the most powerful man on the planet tosses and turns in his extravagantly gilded bedchamber on the Palatine Hill. The Roman emperor is surrounded by heavily armed Praetorian guards, marble statues celebrating his divine glory, and an endless army of servants catering to his superficial whims. Yet, despite possessing an absolute military monopoly and unimaginably vast material wealth, he exists in a perpetual state of terrifying insecurity and mind-numbing paranoia. He cannot even take a sip of his own expensive wine without forcing a slave to taste it first, constantly terrified of a violent assassination. He sleeps with a dagger hidden beneath his silken pillows, forever wondering which of his closest allies is secretly plotting to rip the crown from his head. His authority is incredibly loud, undeniably flashy, and entirely dependent on the fleeting loyalty of ambitious generals who would eagerly slit his throat for a chance at the throne. Down in the silent valley of the Forum, this solitary priestess operates in a radically different paradigm of power that requires absolutely no physical armor or armed bodyguards. She sleeps alone, she works alone, and her circular temple has absolutely no heavy defensive walls to repel an invading army or a mob of angry citizens. Yet, she remains the single most untouchable human being in the entire known world, protected by a deeply ingrained spiritual mandate that surpasses any man-made law. If a violent criminal were to accidentally brush against her pure white robes in the crowded street, the immediate penalty would be an unceremonious and brutal execution. Her extraordinary security does not come from a loud display of dominance or a desperate clinging to external titles, but from an unbreakable inner core of self-mastery. I know. She does not need to threaten anyone with physical violence to command absolute respect, but because her sheer discipline and unwavering focus speak far louder than any military threat, she inherently understands that true, enduring peace never comes from aggressively hoarding worldly possessions or frantically attempting to control the chaotic opinions of a fickle society. While the wealthy elite of Rome exhaust themselves in endless political blood sports to secure temporary influence, Aquilia holds the actual spiritual heartbeat of their entire civilization. She possesses a quiet, electing, unshakable confidence that perfectly mirrors the highest ideal of individual fortitude, proving that genuine strength is cultivated in the dark when no one is watching. The emperor desperately needs the roaring applause of the Colosseum to briefly convince himself that he is safe, while she needs absolutely nothing but her own unyielding competence. She does not seek validation from the noisy crowds, completely satisfied by the profound knowledge that her silent vigilance is the only thing preventing the empire from collapsing. This is the undeniable difference between a fragile ego desperately masquerading as a god and a quietly grounded professional who actually holds the essential keys to the kingdom. Anyone who has ever worked a grueling graveyard shift deeply understands the brutal reality of the infamous 3 o'clock in the morning wall. It is that precise, terrifying hour of the deep night when your biological clock aggressively demands immediate sleep and your mental focus begins to dangerously shatter. The heavy marble walls of the circular sanctuary seem to actively absorb the little remaining warmth from her deeply exhausted body. She has been standing continuously on the freezing stone floor for hours, desperately fighting the overwhelming physiological urge to simply close her heavily burdened eyes and finally rest. Her perfectly maintained posture begins to slightly falter as the relentless, compounding fatigue of a 25-year career suddenly crashes down upon her rigid shoulders. This is the exact moment when the human body usually surrenders to sheer exhaustion, abandoning all professional responsibilities in favour of basic survival. Tonight is not just another quiet evening in the Roman Forum, but rather the chaotic peak of a violently unforgiving winter storm. The ancient architects intentionally left a massive gap in the domed roof to allow the smoke from the sacred hearth to safely escape into the sky. However, this brilliant architectural feature now serves as a massive, gaping funnel for the freezing winter wind to pour directly into the secluded chamber. An intense gust of icy air forcefully whips through the upper columns, screaming like a wounded animal, as it violently spirals downward toward the centre of the room. The usually stable environment of the sanctuary is instantly thrown into absolute chaos as the bitter draft viciously tears at her pure, white woolen garments. The temperature inside the stone vault rapidly plummets below freezing, instantly turning her steady breath into thick clouds of white mist hovering in the darkness. To make matters significantly worse, a critical logistical failure earlier in the day is about to transform this miserable situation into a catastrophic emergency. The heavy oak branches delivered to the temple by the servants that afternoon had been carelessly left exposed to a sudden freezing rainstorm. Aquilia had immediately noticed the problematic moisture trapped deep within the bark, but there was absolutely no time to secure a dry alternative before the sun quickly set. She had meticulously arranged the logs in a highly strategic formation, praying that the intense residual heat of the coals would slowly dry the damp wood before it was needed. But the real secret is that fire operates by its own unforgiving laws of physics, completely ignoring the desperate prayers of even the most powerful priestess in Rome. The trapped moisture inside the heavy timber is now actively resisting the creeping flames, hissing aggressively as the freezing wind desperately tries to extinguish the fragile heat. Suddenly, a massive, unyielding downdraft of freezing air violently crashes through the open roof and slams directly into the centre of the sacred hearth. The towering, majestic flames that had been steadily warming the massive room instantly collapse under the suffocating weight of the brutal winter gust. Instead of a brilliant, life-sustaining golden glow, the fire abruptly shrinks down to a pathetic handful of sickly green embers desperately clinging to the wet bark. The reassuring crackle of burning oak is abruptly replaced by a terrifying, wet hissing sound that echoes like a death sentence against the marble walls. In a single heart-stopping fraction of a second, the glorious light of the Roman Empire is effectively reduced to a struggling, suffocating spark. Now listen carefully, because the sheer adrenaline that instantly floods her frozen veins would completely paralyze an ordinary person with unadulterated, mind-numbing terror. The absolute worst nightmare of her entire existence has just materialized right before her eyes, plunging the sanctuary into a deep, terrifying blanket of encroaching shadows. The heavy stone sanctuary suddenly feels infinitely larger and unspeakably hostile as the once roaring fire is violently reduced to a few pathetic, sputtering green embers. You can physically feel the exact moment the ambient temperature plunges, aggressively pulling the heat directly from Aquilia's skin. Her ragged exhales immediately form thick, desperate clouds of white frost in the freezing air. The comforting aroma of burning oak is instantly replaced by the acrid, sickening stench of wet ash and suffocating smoke. This foul smell clearly signals the sudden collapse of everything she has sworn to protect over the last 25 years. This is not a drill, nor is it a minor inconvenience that can be delegated to a subordinate or casually pushed to tomorrow's busy agenda. It is a massive, catastrophic failure happening in real time as the suffocating darkness aggressively creeps inward from the curved marble walls. Time itself seems to agonizingly stretch and warp, turning every single fraction of a second into a horrifying eternity of paralyzing suspense. The fragile, glowing coals continue to rapidly lose their life-sustaining heat, threatening to plunge the beating heart of the Empire into an eternal night. In the high-stakes world of modern crisis management, a powerful corporate executive might face the terrifying prospect of losing billions of dollars. They might desperately worry about permanently destroying a carefully cultivated professional reputation overnight. But the horrifying reality currently unfolding on this freezing stone floor operates on a level of absolute, unimaginable consequence that makes any modern financial disaster look trivial. If that tiny, fluctuating pulse of orange light finally surrenders to the brutal winter draft, the sacred spiritual contract is completely broken. The unbreakable bond between the powerful gods and the Roman people is instantly and violently severed forever. Millions of oblivious citizens sleep completely unaware just outside these towering walls. To them, a cold hearth practically guarantees that their supposedly invulnerable legions will be brutally slaughtered on foreign battlefields. Aquilia is staring directly at the imminent, terrifying collapse of Western civilization. She intimately holds the sickening knowledge that the survival of the entire superpower is currently hanging by a single microscopic thread. The crushed weight of this apocalyptic responsibility presses heavily down upon her chest with the physical force of a collapsing building. It absolutely demands flawless perfection in a situation where failure essentially means the end of the known world. Beyond the abstract terror of a falling empire, A much more visceral and intensely personal nightmare instantly flashes through her mind as the wet wood stubbornly hisses against the cold. She knows with absolute, terrifying certainty that if the darkness wins this brutal war, she will not simply resign in disgrace to live a quiet life. The agonizing, haunting imagery of the underground crypt at the Campus Celeratus violently forces its way to the forefront of her consciousness. It serves as a terrifying reminder of the suffocating dirt chamber patiently waiting to claim her. She can almost physically feel the heavy ropes tightly binding her wrists while the damp earth is mercilessly shoveled over her living body. This is the ultimate uncompromising deadline, completely devoid of any possible negotiation or mercy from the state. A single miscalculation or a fraction of a second of hesitation translates directly into a slow, unimaginably painful execution in the pitch black. The fragile glowing embers are not just the spiritual anchor of a massive global superpower. They are quite literally the only physical barrier standing directly between her and a horrifying burial in the freezing mud. Every single primitive survival instinct deeply hardwired into the human brain is furiously screaming at her to violently panic and call out for help. Her exhausted body desperately wants to simply collapse onto the freezing floor in absolute, mind-numbing despair. The thick, suffocating smoke aggressively burns her eyes, completely blinding her to the exact location of the remaining dry kindling. Meanwhile, the howling wind maliciously prepares to deliver the final, devastating blow to the fragile sacred hearth. The entire glorious legacy of the Roman state and the fragile lives of millions of ignorant citizens are violently compressed into this terrifying moment. It is the ultimate, defining test of pure human endurance, an apocalyptic nightmare scenario where the slightest nervous tremor could be absolutely fatal. The smallest, panicked intake of breath could permanently extinguish the beautiful light of the ancient world. Could she somehow save the empire while completely alone in the freezing dark, facing a monstrous disaster that no amount of incredible wealth could solve? But what happened next will absolutely surprise you. When faced with the immediate collapse of their entire world, most people would completely surrender to paralyzing panic and absolute despair. They would drop to their knees in tearful desperation, frantically screaming for the invisible gods to miraculously intervene and fix the horrifying disaster unfolding before them. But Aquilia does not waste a single precious second on useless theatrical displays or empty prayers to the silent heavens above her. She operates with the terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency of a seasoned professional who fundamentally understands that survival requires immediately rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work yourself. The sheer muscle memory forged by decades of relentless, punishing discipline instantly overrides any natural biological impulse to freeze in mortal terror. She drops heavily onto the freezing marble floor, entirely ignoring the agonizing pain shooting through her exhausted kneecaps as they violently strike the solid stone. Her piercing eyes narrow with absolute laser-like focus, rapidly calculating the exact trajectory of the vicious draft and the precise location of the dying green embers. There are no specialized iron tongs or protective leather gloves available to carefully manipulate the suffocating pile of damp wood and burning ash. Without a moment of hesitation, she plunges her bare, freezing hands directly into the scorching center of the sacred hearth. She desperately claws through the thick, choking layers of grey soot, completely ignoring the intense, radiating heat violently attacking her raw skin. The sharp, jagged edges of the unburnt oak bark viciously tear at her fragile fingers, leaving dark streaks of crimson blood mixing instantly with the heavy charcoal. Yet her facial expression remains completely devoid of any visible agony, completely detached from the intense physical suffering radiating from her blistered fingertips. She works with the meticulous, high-stakes precision of a master surgeon performing an emergency operation in a war zone, rapidly clearing away the suffocating debris. Every single movement is fiercely intentional and perfectly measured, aggressively fighting against the howling winter storm, trying to rip the remaining heat away. She carefully selects the smallest, driest slivers of oak from the bottom of the pile, pulling them from the heavy shadows. With unbelievable dexterity, she delicately constructs a tiny protective wooden fortress around the violently struggling, microscopic spark of life. The fragile architecture of this new kindling must be absolutely flawless, allowing just enough oxygen to circulate without exposing the vulnerable ember to the deadly downdraft. Here is where it gets interesting, because the true, hidden mastery of her ancient profession is not actually found in the hands, but in the strict, disciplined control of her own lungs. She leans her face incredibly close to the scorching ash, completely ignoring the thick, blinding smoke aggressively burning her eyes and searing her throat. She takes a slow, impossibly deep breath of the freezing winter air, holding it momentarily within her exhausted chest to warm it. Instead of blowing wildly in a desperate panic, she releases a steady, rhythmic, and perfectly controlled stream of oxygen directly into the center of the tiny pyramid. She essentially transforms her own body into a living bellows, using her own vital life force to physically resuscitate the dying heart of the greatest empire on Earth. For what feels like an agonizing eternity, there is absolutely no visible response from the suffocating pile of grey ash and splintered oak. Aquilia maintains her incredibly disciplined rhythm, steadily feeding her own warm breath into the tiny wooden fortress, while the freezing winter wind continues to howl maliciously above her. She completely blocks out the terrifying mental images of the underground crypt, focusing the entirety of her formidable willpower on that single microscopic speck of glowing orange. Suddenly, a tiny wisp of white smoke delicately curls upward from the meticulously arranged dry kindling, signalling a miraculous shift in the brutal elemental war. The fragile spark finally finds the absolute perfect combination of oxygen and dry fuel, greedily consuming the edge of the smallest wooden sliver she had so carefully placed. In the blink of an eye, that desperate wavering spark miraculously transforms into a brilliant determined ribbon of pure golden flame. The fire aggressively climbs the intricate wooden pyramid she constructed, rapidly spreading from the tiny splinters to the larger, heavier branches of seasoned oak waiting just above. A tremendous crackling roar echoes through the heavy marble columns as the sacred hearth violently reclaims its rightful dominance over the freezing winter darkness. You can practically feel the oppressive, suffocating tension instantly evaporating from the freezing air as a massive wave of life-sustaining heat powerfully washes across the circular sanctuary. The menacing shadows that had just threatened to swallow the Roman Empire whole are immediately pushed back, aggressively banished to the absolute farthest edges of the impenetrable stone walls. But the real secret is the profound psychological transformation that occurs in the exact moment the light finally returns to the temple. As the towering flames aggressively reach toward the domed ceiling once again, they cast a magnificent glowing aura across Aquilia's deeply exhausted but entirely unbroken posture. Her pristine white woolen robes are now heavily stained with thick black soot, and her bare hands are bruised and bleeding from her desperate battle in the ashes. Yet, as the warm golden light beautifully illuminates her dirt-streaked face, she does not look like a frightened victim who just narrowly escaped a horrifying execution. Instead, she radiates the fierce, undeniable pride of a highly skilled professional who just stared down an impossible catastrophe and won through sheer, uncompromising grit. She embodies that deeply ingrained spirit of relentless perseverance, proving that the most spectacular victories are often achieved when everything else seems completely hopeless and lost. She slowly pushes herself up from the freezing marble floor, allowing her violently aching muscles to finally absorb the intense, comforting warmth radiating from the resurrected fire. The terrifying apocalyptic nightmare that had just loomed so large over the sleeping city has been completely dismantled by her quiet, unwavering competence in the dark. Millions of citizens will wake up tomorrow morning to a perfectly normal day, utterly oblivious to the phenomenal level of resilience required to secure their peaceful existence. She takes a long, stabilizing breath of the fragrant, smoke-filled air feeling the crushing weight of existential dread finally lift from her painfully burdened shoulders. The eternal flame of Rome is once again burning brilliantly, now completely secured by a solitary woman who absolutely refused to surrender to the unforgiving winter storm. As the violent adrenaline slowly begins to ebb from her exhausted veins, a profound sense of quiet clarity gently washes over the solitary priestess. She stands silently before the beautifully restored hearth, deeply contemplating the massive philosophical difference between her invisible victory and the loud triumphs constantly celebrated outside these walls. When a famous Roman general successfully conquers a foreign territory, the entire city rapidly erupts in deafening cheers, showering his victorious chariot with endless praises and fragrant flower petals. Those aggressive military commanders proudly wear their bronze armour in the bright sunlight, desperately seeking the eternal glory and validation of the roaring, unpredictable masses. They believe history is written by the edge of a blade and the aggressive expansion of borders across the distant, blood-soaked continents. But Aquilia fundamentally understands that those famous, highly decorated swords on the distant battlefields are merely the superficial instruments of an expanding and deeply flawed imperial machine. The actual, unshakable foundation of their entire civilization is not forged in the chaotic noise of deadly combat, but rather in this absolute unwavering vigilance in the pitch black. She has just saved the known world from an absolute catastrophic ruin. Yet there will be no grand parades or golden statues erected in her honour tomorrow morning. This profound lack of public recognition does not bother her in the slightest, because she has finally unlocked a fundamental truth about how the world actually operates. She realises with absolute certainty that the most vital pillars of any great society are rarely the flamboyant politicians or the aggressive conquerors who constantly demand everyone's immediate attention. The true, enduring weight of civilization is entirely carried by the essential unsung heroes who silently execute their exhausting duties when no one is actively watching or cheering. It is the grueling, deeply unglamorous persistence of holding the line in the freezing shadows that truly prevents the heavy gears of society from violently grinding to a halt. The Roman emperor, might foolishly believe his intimidating legions are the ultimate shield of the people, but brute military might means absolutely nothing without the structural foundation remaining intact. 9. Who actually keeps the complicated machinery of a superpower functioning, while the wealthy elite are blissfully asleep in their comfortable, heavily guarded palaces? It is the highly disciplined professionals who willingly sacrifice their personal comfort to stand guard against the encroaching chaos of the unforgiving night, asking for absolutely nothing in return. But the real secret is how this profound realization completely changes the way you must measure the true value of human contribution to a thriving, complex society. The eternal flame she so fiercely protects is no longer just a demanding religious obligation, but a profound symbol of the invisible foundational labour that keeps humanity moving forward. Every time she places another heavy piece of seasoned oak into the glowing coals, she is silently reinforcing the fragile social contract that keeps the dangerous darkness at bay. She finds an immense, quiet dignity in being the invisible caretaker of a massive superpower, completely detached from the toxic, exhausting pursuit of fleeting public fame and political power. This is the ultimate power of the dedicated night watch, a relentless, unspoken commitment to maintaining the essential support systems that everyone else takes for granted during the day. As the ferocious winter storm finally begins to slowly lose its destructive momentum outside the sanctuary, Aquilia simply adjusts her heavy soot-stained robes and peacefully resumes her eternal vigil. She has discovered the absolute, unvarnished truth hidden deep within the freezing shadows, proving that the most important battles are always fought and won in complete and utter silence. Hours slowly pass in absolute silence, and the relentless winter storm finally exhausts its violent fury against the ancient marble columns of the temple. The suffocating, pitch-black darkness that had so aggressively threatened to swallow the sanctuary begins to gradually soften into a deep, bruised purple across the horizon. High above the brilliantly crackling sacred hearth, the large circular opening in the domed roof captures the very first delicate hints of a pale pink dawn. You can almost physically feel the profound shift in atmospheric pressure as the terrifying, deep isolation of the graveyard shift slowly gives way to the inevitable turning of the world. For Aquilia, this gentle transition of natural light does not bring a sudden burst of fresh energy, but rather a crushing wave of absolute, bone-deep physical exhaustion. The massive adrenaline spike that had previously fueled her desperate battle against the dying embers has now entirely evaporated from her system. It leaves her exhausted muscles violently aching, her raw throat burning from the suffocating smoke, and her blistered hands throbbing with a persistent, sharp pain. She stands completely motionless in the centre of the quietly humming room, a solitary, heavily soot-stained guardian passively watching the morning light slowly illuminate the magnificent stone walls of her beautiful cage. Just outside the incredibly thick bronze doors of the guarded temple, the sprawling metropolis of Rome is beginning to eagerly shake off the quiet stillness of the night. The absolute silence of the dark is rapidly replaced by the chaotic and steadily rising symphony of a highly ambitious society aggressively starting its daily grind. You can distinctly hear the heavy wooden wheels of delivery carts loudly clattering against the uneven cobblestones as merchants fiercely compete for positions in the bustling central market. The historical equivalent of the modern, frantic morning rush hour is instantly in full effect, characterized by an overwhelming wave of loud voices, hurried footsteps, and endless commercial transactions. Wherein arrogant politicians fiercely debate entirely trivial matters on the grand marble steps of the Senate, while ordinary citizens hurriedly grab their freshly baked breakfast bread on the go. Everyone is completely consumed by their own individual pursuits of material wealth, social status, and personal convenience, desperately chasing their own version of the ultimate Roman dream. It is a deafening, fiercely competitive environment that intensely prioritizes loud self-promotion and relentless forward momentum, showing absolutely no regard for the silent, invisible sacrifices made in the shadows. Now listen carefully, because the sheer magnitude of this historical is something that perfectly mirrors the most deeply melancholic aspects of our own modern civilization. Thousands of energetic, intensely focused people are currently rushing past the impenetrable walls of the sanctuary, eagerly complaining about the freezing weather, or stressing over their minor financial inconveniences. They are completely and utterly oblivious to the terrifying, apocalyptic fact that their entire known universe was hanging by a microscopic, fragile thread just a few short hours ago. They will casually go about their incredibly demanding professional schedules, firmly believe that the majestic empire automatically protects them from all external harm. They will never realize that their peaceful morning was only secured because a solitary woman violently dug through burning ash with bleeding hands in the dead of winter. There is a profound, almost heartbreaking tragedy in how effortlessly a bustling, self-absorbed society ignores the immense invisible labor that actively prevents its own catastrophic destruction every single night. The loud, vibrant city simply takes the golden light of the eternal flame for granted, blindly treating it as an automatic guarantee rather than a fragile miracle secured through unimaginable suffering as the brilliant rays of the morning sun finally cascade down through the open roof. The heavy bronze doors of the sanctuary slowly creak open behind her aching back. Another deeply dedicated, incredibly poised priestess quietly steps into the circular chamber, her white woolen robes completely pristine and entirely untouched by the horrifying chaos of the previous night. There is absolutely no dramatic, emotional handover of supreme power, no desperate retelling of the apocalyptic disaster that was so narrowly avoided in the freezing dark. Aquilia simply offers a silent, deeply tired nod of professional acknowledgement to her perfectly rested colleague, officially transferring the crushing, existential weight of the entire empire for the next several hours. She slowly turns away from the beautifully roaring fire she fought so fiercely to save, her bare, heavily blistered feet, quietly padding across the freezing marble floor toward her private quarters. She carries the terrifying, monumental secret of the 3 o'clock hour entirely alone within her own mind, asking for no medals, no public praise, and no sympathetic understanding. She finds a strange, profoundly melancholic peace in the absolute certainty that the noisy, arrogant world outside will never truly understand exactly what it takes to let them safely sleep. When you closely examine this ancient narrative of quiet endurance, you suddenly realize that the sacred fire of Rome never actually extinguished. It simply changed its physical form and seamlessly evolved into the crushing weight of essential responsibility carried by millions of hard-working individuals today. If you completely strip away the pure white woolen robes and the heavy marble columns, Aquilia is no longer just a distant historical figure frozen in time. She instantly becomes a profound, living reflection of the deeply exhausted but entirely unyielding guardians operating in the shadows of our fast-paced modern world. Fast forward thousands of years from that freezing Roman valley, and you will easily find yourself standing in the neon-lit concrete canyons of any major American city at 3 o'clock in the morning. While the vast majority of the population is comfortably asleep in their warm suburban beds, a massive, invisible network of essential human infrastructure is quietly fighting its own desperate battles against the darkness. This incredibly demanding 24-hour cultural machine we so proudly celebrate completely relies on a dedicated army of silent watchers who fundamentally refuse to let the crucial gears of society stop turning. Look closely through the brightly illuminated windows of a sprawling urban hospital, and you will immediately see her modern descendants wearing heavily stained scrubs instead of sacred reverse garments. The deeply fatigued intensive care nurse meticulously monitors the fragile, wavering heartbeat of a complete stranger, actively fighting off her own agonizing physical exhaustion to keep that tiny spark of human life brightly burning. Across town in a heavily secured, completely windowless room, the emergency medical dispatcher calmly orchestrates a chaotic web of police and rescue units, holding the crumbling edges of a terrified community together with just her incredibly steady voice. Yonk. Even in the quiet residential suburbs, you can easily find the exhausted single parent quietly returning home from a grueling third shift at the industrial warehouse, fiercely determined to keep the metaphorical lights on for their sleeping children. But wait, there is more. The terrifying, suffocating winter storms these modern guardians face are not made of freezing wind and wet oak, but rather the crushing contemporary pressures of chronic professional burnout, severe financial anxiety, and relentless emotional fatigue. Yet, exactly like the ancient priestess desperately kneeling in the soot, they aggressively roll up their sleeves and deliberately plunge their bare hands into the metaphorical ashes of our daily crises. These are the fiercely dedicated night watchmen of the modern American dream, the ultimate unsung heroes carrying the immense burdens that allow the rest of the country to safely close its eyes. They do not receive glorious ticker-tape parades down crowded city avenues, nor do they seek the superficial validation of a society completely obsessed with daytime achievements. They find their profound purpose in the heavy knowledge that their silent sacrifices directly prevent the fragile world around them from instantly plunging into absolute chaos. The eternal flame they desperately protect is the immense burden of providing for a family, the uncompromising duty to save lives, and the resilience required to survive another night. Every single night, they make the exact same quiet choice to endure the immense pressure so that the chaotic machinery of our bustling nation never experiences a catastrophic failure. You might even recognize a small reflection of your own life in this ancient story, in quietly holding the line for the people you fiercely love when the darkness feels overwhelming. We owe an incalculable debt of profound gratitude to these modern guardians who tirelessly tend the vital embers of our civilization while we blindly take their monumental efforts for granted. If you travel to the vibrant heart of modern Rome today, the awe-inspiring landscape of the ancient empire looks vastly different than it did during Aquilia's agonizing midnight vigil. The once mighty Temple of Vesta is now nothing more than a fragile, yet picturesque ring of broken stone columns standing quietly amidst the overgrown grass of the ruined forum. The terrifying, who once ruled the known world with iron fists and endless paranoia, have long since crumbled into the forgotten dust of ancient history. Their magnificent palace are entirely empty. Their invincible legions are gone, and the incredibly complex political machinery they built eventually collapsed beneath the crushing weight of time and human folly. Yet, the central idea that this solitary woman is protected during that freezing winter storm never actually perished with the physical fall of the magnificent marble. The literal wooden coals may have finally burned out centuries ago, but the profound spiritual concept of the eternal flame gracefully transcended the complete destruction of the physical Roman Empire, embedding itself into the collective soul of humanity. Aquilia herself left behind absolutely no towering monuments, no celebrated biographies, and no golden statues boldly demanding the admiration of future generations in crowded public squares. She completely faded into the obscure shadows of history, perfectly embodying the quiet, unglamorous nature of the monumental task she had sworn her entire life to meticulously execute. However, her breathtaking legacy actively survives in the unbreakable human instinct to fiercely protect the fragile light of civilization against the encroaching darkness of an unpredictable universe. That fierce dedication was never truly bound to a single physical occasion or a specific religious dogma, but was rather an enduring testament to human resilience and silent sacrifice. We are all deeply connected to that ancient circular room by an invisible, unbroken chain of ordinary people who willingly take on the heavy responsibility of standing guard. It is a beautiful, unsolvable puzzle of human endurance, reminding us that the past is not merely a closed book, but a continuous cycle of extraordinary dedication that silently spans across millennia. Allow the soothing realization of this collective human protection to slowly unravel the lingering knots of anxiety hidden deep within your exhausted muscles and your overactive mind. The freezing winter storms of your personal and professional life will inevitably continue to blow, but you are safely insulated from their biting chill for the next several hours. You have successfully completed your own demanding shift in the relentless daily march of modern civilization, and your absolute only remaining duty right now is to simply let go of the day. The comforting darkness surrounding you is no longer a menacing void to be feared, but a deeply restorative blanket offering a profound, well-deserved escape from your endless waking responsibilities. As your breathing naturally deepens and your thoughts gently drift away into the quiet ether, take comfort in the absolute certainty that the eternal flame is still burning brightly in the steady hands of others. The massive and complicated world will safely wait for your return until the morning sun beautifully rises again across the horizon. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the shadows of ancient Rome. Yarn. If you found a moment of comfort in this story of quiet endurance, I invite you to leave a comment below and share your own experiences of holding the line in the dark. Your incredible support is what allows us to continue exploring these forgotten corners of history together. Please consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue uncovering the fascinating mysteries of the past in our next late-night adventure. Until then, allow your heavy eyes to finally close, release the lingering tension from your tired shoulders, and completely surrender to the restorative embrace of sleep. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.